Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud while Stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 3 of Little Blue Book number 1087, titled The Facts About Fascism, written by Miriam Allen DeFord, copyright 1926, May of 1926, in fact. So this was written during the period that fascism was in power in Italy, and it is written prior to World War II. So they make mention to the World War, and they were referring to number 1, because number 2 hasn't happened yet when this was written. Okay, so here we go. We're going to do chapter 3, the first year of fascism. The first test of strength in the fascist organization came in May 1923, in the conflict with the Catholic Party. This party had agreed to work with the fascists after inducements had been offered them, similar to those described in the last chapter. But they were not willing to swallow Mussolini's stock and barrel, and the resignation of the 4 popular Catholic Party members of his cabinet was demanded by him. Since these 4 men were unable, though willing, to induce their party Congress to pass a resolution endorsing fascism in total, and instead had to endure a counter-resolution referring to the present rule as a passing phase. Given the choice of leaving their party or the cabinet, the 4 took the latter alternative when their repudiation of the party's action was rejected. For a time, it was uncertain whether the fascists had split the Popular Party or the Catholics had split the Fascist Party. Finally, the fascists weathered the storm, but the growing discontent was evidenced by an episode on June 3rd of 1923, when the fascisti marched through the streets of Naples without receiving the slightest popular applause from the gathered crowds. On the other hand, it must be remembered that fascism had its birth and was always strongest in northern Italy and weakest in southern Italy. Moreover, in July, the fascists evidenced their triumphant strength by the passage of their electoral reform bill, giving the party winning a plurality, not necessarily a majority, of votes, a 2/3 block in the Chamber of Deputies, the system explained in the previous chapter, by a vote of 335 to 139. At the same time, the Grand Fascist Council announced through its Secretary General a party enrollment of 1 million members, and the Cabinet passed a regulation prohibiting the publication of false or biased news, which simply meant a more drastic press censorship than ever. Nevertheless, there were not wanting signs of internal dissension and weakness. Indeed, the press censorship was in itself a confession of this, which culminated in September in Mussolini's first gesture of imperial defiance, a move to focus the attention of the Italians on questions outside their domestic government. Taxes had gone up enormously, and wages had gone down. In an effort to force all workers into the national fascist unions, workers largely recalcitrant socialists, on the few enterprises not yet under fascist dominance, were reported as having to work for 4 lira a day, as against 14 to 16 lira the year before. At the same time, members of the fascist unions were getting 12 lira a day, though even this was below the previous wage scale, and the cost of living had risen. The 9-hour day is now being enforced. Early in September, the workers of Parma revolted against such conditions and called a general strike. It was, of course, hopeless. The fascists crushed it instantly. Their methods are evidenced by a manifesto issued by the National Fascist Party Parma Command, and by a letter sent to all businessmen of Parma. The manifesto reads, "The citizens of Parma are asked to resume their normal routine before 4 p.m. today. We hereby notify you that any stores remaining closed after that hour will be devastated, and all those who have not returned to their customary work by that time will be treated as enemies to the country." The letter to businessmen indicated whence came the sinews of war. "We fascisti are sacrificing our lives to breaking off this strike by every means. It is your duty to aid our movement financially in order to save the nation. We therefore ask you to turn over the bearer of this message, Blancamano Lira, write in whatever, and we warn you that whoever tries to evade this duty will have to pay for it. Signed, the Secret Committee of Action. What paying for it meant may be read between the lines of the bulletin posted by the fascists early in their career, when they captured the theretofore socialist city of Civitavecchia. Conditions of peace. 1. Resignation of the city government. 2. Cooperatives to be turned over to the fascist unions. 3. Demonstrations of Italianism by all citizens. Demonstrations of Italianism were customarily enforced by castor oil, burning, looting, and dagger and bomb. Mussolini's futile efforts to force an agreement made by D'Annunzio as arbiter between the ship owners and the Italian Seamen's Federation, practically the last of the old unions, and the only one which had met the fascists on their own ground and compelled their surrender, was another evidence of his waning popular prestige. But luck was still with him. It provided an international incident which distracted the attention of the Italians and solidified them once more against the common object of hatred outside of themselves. At the beginning of September, a boundary commission of Italians was sent to Albania. 3 Italian officers, members of this commission, were murdered in Ephrus by persons unknown but resembling Greek officers. Immediately, the fascists made excessive and insulting demands for reparation. And Greece, exhausted and powerless, and knowing well how Italy covets the land it holds on the Mediterranean, had little choice but to agree. National honor, however, dictated a refusal of some, at least, of these demands. Thereupon, the Italians occupied Corfu, the property of Greece, and opened fire on it, killing not obdurate Greeks, but 16 little children, Armenian refugees, and a few humble inhabitants of the island. J. Dennis Drake, an American traveling in Greece, wrote vividly of the contrast between these two outrages. I happened to be in Rome the day that the funeral of the Italian officers assassinated in Genoa took place. I cannot describe the splendor of it. There were dukes and princes and all kinds of nobles, a wonderful display of gold and decorations and all the magnificence of the military order. The best orators of the country eulogized the dead officers. They died for duty, martyrs of the cause of civilization. The whole world took notice of it and grieved for such a great loss, for a general was killed. Now, gentlemen, just about a week before the great funeral in Rome, another took place in the island of Corfu. There were over 20 coffins. No princes or dukes to follow them, no guns to give them the last salute, no one to take care of the bereaved families. Very little did the outside world hear about it. No one took their cause before the League of Nations. They were merely human beings. I am referring to the victims of the Italian bombardment. Tomorrow, there will be statues in Rome proclaiming to the world that those officers died while serving civilization and liberty. But who will care enough to put a wooden cross on the graves of those poor refugees? I doubt if any will, for they wore no gold on their shoulders, no crown upon their caps. Still that way. What this episode meant to the fascists is indicated by an article by Paul Blanchard in The Nation for September 26, 1923, written in Milan on September 2nd. He described the excitement, the anger against Greece. We're going to pause. The fascisti get to work. Tablets commemorating Greek heroes in Genoa were torn down and Italian ones substituted. The commander of a Greek-Italian ship in Naples is ordered to run up the Italian flag. The chorus for war is almost unanimous. A commissioned merchant of chocolate products tells me gleefully that business will increase during war. Of the newspapers, only Avanti tries to analyze the situation honestly, and even Avanti does not speak in ringing tones. The Italian socialists have no love for the Greek government, and they have vivid recollections of recent fascisti raids. The situation provides an excellent stage setting for Mussolini. Fighting is the safest thing for the immediate future of fascism, because fascism lives by fighting. Things have been getting dull at home. The black shirts are losing some of their first glamour. In fact, these shirts are beginning to look uncommonly like workmen's shirts. War! A happy thought. Anybody can run a government during a war. War! A note to Greece that would draw wrath from China. But the fascists soon found that they had bitten off more than they could chew. Corfu is the Gibraltar of the Adriatic. It was impossible for Italy to hold it without the consent of England and France, and that consent could not be obtained. Mussolini could not withdraw, on the other hand, without loss of prestige to the fascists. In his dilemma, he finally had to resort to the intervention of an outside power. The League of Nations, formed for just such cases, wanted to arbitrate, but Mussolini refused to deal with the League. The Council of the League then backed water. It effected a compromise by which the matter was settled by the Council of Ambassadors, an extra legal body representing only the allied powers of the World War. This council brought about an agreement whereby the fascists got no more than they would have received from Greece had they conducted the entire matter in a spirit of cooperation. But national honor was satisfied on all sides, and the fascists had passed another crisis. Meanwhile, a tendency ominous to fascist power appeared in the United Front movement, emerging among the disintegrated socialist and communist parties of Italy. For the first time since the splits arising from the failure of the great general strike in 1921, the communist and the left-wing socialist acted in concert in a manifesto addressed to the entire proletariat. It was the first stirring of the only force which can finally conquer fascism in Italy and anywhere else. That the fascist theories and tactics, in the meantime, remained unchanged is evidenced by two documents. The first is a labor program of the Fascist Labor Federation. It concludes, among other interesting items, perhaps the strangest version of the right to strike heretofore on record. Here's what it says. Syndicalism is no longer, as formerly, a specific expression of classes and workers' interest, but a constitutional manifestation of the people at large. In other words, it identifies itself with the nation. The interest and the duty of all classes is a progressive and intense production proportionate to the ever-growing needs of the nation. The increase of productive activities means an expansion of riches and the enlargement of the middle class. It becomes essential then to give elite of the working class a chance for the direct acquisition and management of the instruments and means of production. Sounds familiar? We have no objection to any form of organization of labor, provided that it really represents technical capacity and intelligence, and provided that it remains on a basis of free competition without interference on the part of the state organs. However, the specific principle of fascist syndicalism does not admit the organization of labor along class lines. It cannot admit either general strikes embracing all the industries or a strike of a single industry covering the whole national territory. On the contrary, the struggle for capacities admits the practice of factional struggle, with an eventual implication of the right to strike, although such strikes ought to be localized or called against groups obnoxious to the general interest of labor and national production. Otherwise, the struggle would become of a political character. The methods by which these aims pleasing to the bourgeoisie of all nations, were meanwhile being attained may be learned from an appeal to the workers and workers' organizations of all countries, issued about this same time, the end of 1923, by the Central Committee of the Italian Syndicalist Union. Although officially dissolved, many of the pre-fascist organizations still carry on a truncated existence, issuing their publications secretly. And here's their issue. As reaction in Italy proceeds with its work of destruction, the breaking up of surviving syndical organizations continues along with the persecution and murder of workers, while the prisons are still being crowded with victims. The courts are overrun with comrades involved in cases which have been forced to trial by the police and judicial authorities. During the last 3 years of close cooperation between the courts, the police, and fascism. Even in these last few days, the Arezzo trial against the Valderno miners and the Turin trial against the Minervino Merge peasants have both resulted in outrageous verdicts against our comrades, who were insulted with impunity in the courtroom by the lawyers, the pressmen, and the fascisti caliphs, who in some cases even attempted to lynch the condemned men. During the last few days, the comrades of Valderno, Minervino Merge, and Seragina have been sentenced to terms amounting altogether to more than 15 centuries. The sentences vary from 10, 20 to 30 years, very few being granted easier terms. Phew. It must be remembered that these sentences, as bad as the sentences passed during and after the war upon radicals in America, were for no other crime than resistance to the fascist terror. Although we must in all such cases discount the effects of factional enthusiasm and the natural tendency to exaggeration caused by the emotion of the minority bodies. Nevertheless, such hard facts as jail sentences and proved murders are not susceptible to challenge. It is true that there have been several amnesties of political offenders during the fascist regime, but these amnesties chiefly applied to fascist offenders guilty of violence. Moreover, the prisons have speedily been filled up again, and frequently by the same men. The true fascist method with a prominent antagonist is not so much to imprison him as to hound him to death. Examples of that will be given later. The amnesties seem to be like the declaration of the establishment of the Italian prisons of the honor system, a graceful gesture which placates outsiders and does not mean anything. The months following the Epirus incident were largely occupied with pacts between Italy and other countries under fascist supervision of the terms of these pacts. The most important was the trade agreement with Russia, February 7th of 1924. It was signed, of course, under duress. The Russian trade was so badly needed by impoverished and distracted Italy that in order to drown a possible rebellion, the fascists were obliged to take the dangerous step of introducing the example of the red flag on the Russian consulate. At the same time, or shortly before, January 27th, the Italian-Yugoslav pacts were signed between these two countries, with Mussolini, of course, as the plenipotentiary for the King of Italy. These pacts primarily concerned the Free State of Fiume, granted to Italy by the Rapallo Treaty of November 12, 1920. By Article 9, the Serbian minorities in Fiume were granted the regime established in favor of the Italian minorities in Dalmatia. The last seal had been put on D'Annunzio's campaign to capture Fiume, from which fascism really had its origin. But the chief foreign concerns of the fascist government at this period, and one which at the present writing is growing progressively more troublesome, was the question of the Italian role of South Tyrol. This territory, arbitrarily separated by treaty from North Tyrol, and equally German in its population and traditions. The fascists, from the beginning, had endeavored to Italianize by their usual methods. Names of places were changed from the German to the Italian tongue. Legal documents in German were forbidden. Certain offices could be held only by those speaking Italian, and a harsh system of compulsory Italian speaking was introduced in the public schools. The spirit of the fascist rule was shown when a harmless procession of Tyrolese costume in Lausanne was fired on without provocation, and a schoolteacher named Franz Immermann was killed in cold blood. There was no punishment for this crime. Instead, it was followed by other outrages. The property of Germans had been confiscated wholesale, in many cases reducing aged and infirm persons to the depths of poverty. A typical case follows from an article by Robert Dell in The Nation for May 28, 1924. Frau Maria Butenauer, a widow aged 71, owns in Meran a modest house worth about 50 lira, where she lives. Her sole means of livelihood are the rent that she obtains from letting the greater part of the house and what her daughter earned. Renting the greater part of the house and what her daughter earns by giving piano lessons. Her house and all her furniture, including the beds and the daughter's piano and music, have been confiscated. She must pay rent for a room in her own house or be put on the street. She was forbidden by the authorities to cut firewood from a tree in the garden and was obliged to go without fire, having no means to buy coal. It is no wonder that the people of South Tyrol are in open revolt against such tyranny, and that the territory is one of the festering wounds which may yet mean the death of fascism. A year later, Mussolini's gratuitous defiance of Germany, of which we shall treat later, arose directly from conditions in South Tyrol. At this period, however, fascism was still supreme. At the election in April of 1924, the fascists won 374 out of 535 seats in the Chamber of Deputies, and parties friendly to them secured nearly 30 more. In fact, they secured 18 seats more than they would have been entitled to by the new electoral system. They needed this strength. In the summer of 1924 came an event which rocked the fascist party and nearly brought it to its downfall: the murder of Deputy Matteotti. But before we enter in detail into this immensely important and far-reaching affair, let us turn our attention for a minute to a reverberation of fascist power in the country in which we ourselves live. Not a manifestation of international fascism, of which there are many evidences, here as well as in Greece, Spain, France, England, Germany, and elsewhere, but a direct interference of the Italian fascist government with the government of the United States of America. Already in March 1923, a meeting of 2,000 Italian trade unionists in New York had endeavored to send a cablegram to Avanti in Milan reading, "2,000 workers in mass gathering protest, misdeeds, assassination, fascisti government. Promise moral and financial aid. Help victims. Awful barbarism." This message was refused in Italy. This, of course, is hardly surprising, and is even defensible. One would hardly expect a foreign government to accept complacently such an indictment from even its own compatriots. But far worse was to follow. An anti-fascist labor journal in the Italian language was published in New York by Carlo Tresca, for years prominent in the American radical movement. It was named Il Martello. the hammer. From June of 1923 onward, a series of mysterious persecutions began to be directed against Tresca and his paper. On June 17th, he was forbidden to speak in Buffalo by the police of that city. His July 21st issue was suspended from the mails without warning and with no specific charge against it. On August 14th, he was arrested, charged with publishing obscene matter in his issue of May 5th, just about time, it will be noted, for the paper to get to Italy and the protests to come back. This article was called "Down with the Monarchy." Its alleged obscenity consisted of references to the motives which determine royal marriages. In effect, Tresca was being arrested in America for lèse majesté against the King of Italy, the complacent follower of fascism. The indictment was finally dropped. On September 6th, he was forbidden to speak in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, though he had a permit from the mayor. On August 18th, he was forced to delete from his paper a notice carried without trouble by two others. On October 27th, he was compelled to make an entirely new run of the edition, omitting a story about the administration of castor oil to a woman by the Fascisti. The issue of November 10th was suspended because of an article quoting Arthur Brisbane to the effect that Mussolini would meet the same fate as Renzi. The issue of November 21st was declared unmailable because it charged that Mussolini had kept for his election expenses a sum of money intended for D'Annunzio's use in Fiume. At this time, Tresca charged that the unexplained suspension of his July 21st issue had been due to a demand by the Italian ambassador Prince Settoni. Finally, on November 27th, Tresca was tried and convicted for advertising an Italian book on birth control in El Martello. The advertisement had been deleted when it was declared unmailable, and two other papers had carried it and been mailed without protest. Moreover, an Italian bookstore in New York has sold the book openly, and the customs authorities have not prevented its entry. What was wanted by the Fascisti was not only Tresca's arrest, but also his deportation to Italy, where he would be dealt with as befitted a man who was causing friction between two governments. And that's a comment by a member of our State Department. Lovely. Tresca's conviction was upheld, and he has since served his term in Atlanta Penitentiary. Meanwhile, the fascists have kept on organizing in America. The Italian Fascisti of Boston and the Sons of Italy of New York are both recognized by the Italian fascist government. They prevented a Tresca protest meeting at Waterbury, Connecticut, and even shot up a similar meeting at Lawrence, Massachusetts. They have a paper in New Haven, which acknowledged as early as March of 1923 that the regular fascist tactics to secure recruits were being employed on Italians in America. This paper quotes a fascist agent who assures us that all the members are enthusiastic and that he has performed the miracle of securing the support of two men who were easily converted by the simple threat of a small dose of castor oil. The New York organization marched in a Memorial Day parade in 1923 in the glorious black shirts, singing the notorious Dagger and Bomb song. And here's just a little bit of that song. With the dagger and the bomb and a life of terror, when the shell bursts, our heart does not trouble. We'll lead in the attack. We'll throw ourselves on the enemy, armed with dagger and bomb, and in his blood we'll drown him. Boy, that's lovely. The oath of this American branch of the Fascisti, based on the original fascist oath, reads in part, I swear upon my honor to serve with fidelity and discipline the fascist ideal of a society based on religion, the fatherland, the family, and respect of order, the law, the hierarchy, and the traditions of the race. To maintain alive the veneration of Italy, which is the fatherland or origin and beacon eternal of civilization and grandeur. To combat with all my might theories and ideas which tend to subvert, corrupt, and divide religion, the fatherland, or the family. In opposition to this organization, the Italian Chamber of Labor of the United States has cooperated in organizing an anti-fascisti alliance representing 150,000 Italian trade unionists of America. The answer of the fascist government to the defiant manifesto issued by this body was the pronouncement of exile and loss of Italian citizenship upon several prominent anti-fascist Italians in the United States and confiscation of their property in Italy. This is a development of the present year, 1926. With this understanding of the nearness to us of the fascist threat, let us now return to the summer of 1924 and the murder of Matteotti. And that's the end of chapter 3. That was a little bit of a long one. So, that is the end of chapter 3 of Little Blue Book number 1087, titled The Facts About Fascism, written by Miriam Allen DeFord, copyright May of 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 4.